Thank you everyone for having me. As Julie said, my job is the clinical trial leader at the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. My job is to oversee the phase 3 program in the US, Canada, and Israel, and to make sure that we successfully go towards drug development and approval, hopefully, of MDMA for PTSD. So the major update I really want to update you on is that the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation got an awesome, trippy new logo, as you see here. And since I'm with child, I have not had a psychedelic experience in well over 6 months, and I will take it when I can get it. So I'm not going to spend too much time going over the background of MAPS, the history of MDMA, scheduling, and therapy in the 70s and all of that, because Rick did an amazing TED Talk this year, and you can watch and learn all about that. So also, I think this audience is the most familiar with MAPS research of any audience that I've ever seen before. So what I really want to talk about is what's been going on in the last year since Horizons. So we've been working really hard on our phase 3 trials. We opened our first phase 3 trial shortly after Horizons last year. And our phase 3 trials are running because the FDA has decided that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD is a breakthrough treatment, meaning that the data that we have so far is better than the existing drugs on the market, and this is a life-threatening condition that they really want us to find an effective treatment for. So we have the support of the FDA in our process, which is really helpful. I will give you a tiny bit of background on the therapeutic approach. This is a picture of Annie and Michael Mithofer with I believe that's not a real study participant, but a model. But we have a co-therapy pair in the living room style, just like many of the other studies you've seen presented up here today. And we do inner-directed therapy, so we're really letting the participant lead the way, letting the MDMA catalyze the therapy process, and having the therapists kind of get out of the way and let that happen. So this is the pathway to approval and what we've been working on so far. So in the winter of 2017, we started a phase 2 study, which is our open label lead-in for phase 3. So this was a study that we gave about 37 participants MDMA. They all had PTSD, and the point of this was to train new therapy pairs. So a big part of my presentation will go over the data from that study, which just recently finished. In the fall of 2018, we opened our first phase 3 study, double-blind, placebo-controlled. This is our pivotal study that we hope will demonstrate that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is effective in treating PTSD. Around the same time last year, and through this year, we've had applications open for expanded access sites. Expanded access has not yet been approved by the FDA, but we are interested in networking with clinicians and sites and potential providers for this therapy in the future and building up that network. This spring, we'll be opening our second phase 3 study. This will hopefully confirm the results from the first study and help us move towards approval. In the fall of 2019, we'll be opening our, that's about now, but we're working on opening our phase 2 and 3 studies in Europe. In 2021, we plan to submit our new drug application to the FDA. In 2022, we expect to do the same thing in Europe with the European Medicines Agency. And then for many years after that, we'll be doing post-marketing studies and working on new indications. So we're quite busy, and we plan to be for the next several years, including after MDMA is hopefully approved. So these are the results from the phase 2 studies that we've done in the past. You might have seen this data before. At the conclusion of treatment, so every participant has received at least 2 or 3 MDMA-assisted psychotherapy sessions. 56% of those people no longer met criteria for PTSD at the end of the study. And of the rest of those folks, a lot of them did not, had a large reduction in symptoms, but still met the criteria. So that means if you don't meet the criteria for PTSD, you don't have the cluster of symptoms that the DSM-5 defines as PTSD. 12 months later, we did a follow-up study to make sure, or follow-up observational data to make sure that these effects lasted longer than those 3 sessions, and we found that actually the effects were more effective after the 12-month follow-up. So 68% of participants no longer met criteria for PTSD. So as Dr. Watts was talking earlier about kind of planting the seed, opening the door, Many of these subjects were able to go through the door and find more healing after the study than they even were during the study for us. So this year we published the data from those 6 phase 2 studies. This is in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and you can find this online. Like USONA, MAPS is committed to open access, open science, so all of our published articles are available for free online. So if you're looking for this, you can find it on their website or through the MAPS website, which also has many other wonderful resources for you. But our open label lead-in, the trial that I was just talking about to train our new therapists, actually had really similar data, which we were really excited about. So we tried this study at 15 sites with 36 new therapy pairs. The thing that was most exciting to us, or to me at least, is that in our phase 2 studies, we had some amazing therapists, the Mithofers, Marcelo Odalora, Bruce Poulter, many others. But those were our original awesome therapists. And we were hoping that when we train 36 new therapy pairs, they'd be able to reproduce the same type of data, and they did. So this means, 1, our training program is really effective, and 2, our original therapists are great, great trainers. And our new ones are really effective therapists too. Our CAPS-5, so this is the clinician-administered PTSD scale. This is the data that the outcome measure that we collect to test people's PTSD symptoms. The reduction was at 28.66 points. This is a huge reduction in PTSD symptoms for these participants. If you are really MAPS nerdy and you're thinking, oh wow, that's a different number than the phase 2 data that you've already published on, that's because the previous 6 phase 2 studies were done with the CAPS-4, which means they were connected to the DSM-4, and since then the DSM has been updated to DSM-5, so we're using the CAPS-5. So it's not a point-to-point value. These are similar reductions in symptoms. So this means that our data was reproducible across new therapists, new sites, new participants in a new study. This is really, really good to indicate that our phase 3 trials will be the same. We also demonstrated through phase 2 that our drug is safe, our MDMA is safe in controlled clinical settings when we've screened appropriately for participants, making sure no one has cardiac histories that might interfere with MDMA. Our efficacy has a large effect size in a 3-session model. And the cause of PTSD did not influence the outcome. So participants came to us with a variety of different types of traumas: sexual abuse, natural disasters, job exposure to various types of gruesome events. And all of these types of PTSD were able to be treated effectively with MDMA. So another publication we've done this year is the breakthrough therapy analysis of the efficacy of MDMA versus paroxetine and sertraline. So paroxetine and sertraline are the 2 SSRIs that are on the market currently for PTSD, Paxil and Zoloft, and they have limited efficacy, as you might imagine. And so we've done a review to compare the data we have so far with the data from those trials, which is something people have been asking us for a while. So I do recommend that you check out this article in Frontiers. I'll speak to this briefly just to sum up what our phase 3 study design is. And this is the same design we used in the most recent phase 2 study. We screen our participants extensively to make sure they're healthy enough to receive MDMA and that they're going to be able to commit to our study trial. The study is really difficult for participants. They're faced with 42 hours of psychotherapy, which is a lot to commit to. So we want to make sure folks are committed to working with us through that. And they're the people that we're most grateful to make this work possible. So once they're screened and in the study, we do prep sessions, prepare them for MDMA treatment. We do 3 experimental sessions, 8 hours, all day, eye shades, music, living room situation, all the things you're familiar with from other psychedelic studies. And during those, they receive either MDMA or placebo. So as you've heard from other talks, The placebo can actually be quite effective. So set and setting and the psychotherapy with wonderful, calm, gentle psychotherapists can be quite effective. Usually we see a reduction in PTSD scores across the board. It's just much more significant with MDMA. After each experimental session, we do 3 integration sessions. These are 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions where we work with what's been going on at the session and deal with those insights, figure out how to reincorporate those into daily life. At most of our sites, we do an overnight stay after the experimental session, so this is kind of the first thing they do in the morning after. But we do have 2 sites that participants are going home and spending the night with a loved one instead of staying at the study site, and that's been quite effective too. And then treatment ends. During this whole time, we're doing lots and lots of different assessments, PTSD assessments, suicidality, safety, so taking lots of vital signs, and doing lots of measures. Something else that we're proud of is that in our open label study, the most recent phase 2 study, our demographics became much more representative from our previous studies. So in this most recent study, we had about 70% white, not Hispanic or Latino participants, and about 30% of participants of color, which is a vast improvement from our previous studies. It's still not perfect. There are definitely populations that are underrepresented in this trial, but we are moving forward with phase 3. We have plans in place, and we have current incentive programs in place to make sure that participants of color will be able to get lost wages recouped, or childcare, or transportation, or things they need to be able to participate in our studies that might have been a barrier before. And we're dedicated to providing culturally competent care and including everyone in our studies. So we're delighted about this improvement and hope it continues to improve moving forward. We had a reasonable gender balance. We had more females than males assigned at birth, but nothing too overwhelming. And our age bracket was reasonably diverse, with most people between 20 and 40, but some across the spectrum. So this is our phase 3 team. This does not include all the contractors that work at MAPS, but this is just the team that we're working with, our full-time employees. Julie Holland is also one of our medical monitors, not pictured here. But one thing that's pretty cool is that a year ago today, we had 21 people on our payroll, and today we have over 40. So the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation has doubled in size, meaning we either really underestimated how much work this was, which is probably true, definitely true, actually. It's a lot of work. And there's just so much more to be done. So our phase 3 strategy is, as I said, we have 2 studies so that we can confirm twice that this work is effective in a large scale across the country, in Canada and in Israel. We have a blinded independent rater pool for our outcome assessments. So this means that individual psychologists and therapists that are not related to our study in any other way are the folks that are assessing to make sure our participants, or to evaluate whether our participants had decreases in their PTSD symptoms, and they help us with screening our participants as well. So this minimizes the bias of having the therapists who are treating the participant themselves evaluating whether their PTSD is improving. Again, it's randomized, so 50% of participants get MDMA and 50% get placebo. But since the study is so hard, and because we want people to be able to have treatment for their PTSD with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, we will have a crossover study at the end of each phase 3 trial to have those placebo participants take MDMA therapy and do the study again. So that'll give us some more safety data and also get them the treatment that we would like to provide. So this is just another way to look at kind of what we've been working on and what we are going to be working on in this US-focused phase 3 program for the next few years. So the first open label was completed. We're currently in MAP 1, which is our pivotal phase 3 trial. MAP 2 will start at the beginning of next year. We'll have our long-term follow-up study starting very soon and continuing on throughout the whole program, and then our placebo crossover study as well. These are our FDA phase 3 sites. There are 15 of them. 2 of them are in New York City. One at NYU with Dr. Michael Bogenschutz overseeing, and one a private practice site led by Ingmar Gorman and Casey Paleos. So we have 11 in the US, 2 in Canada, and 2 in Israel. Those are not pictured because the scale will get really kind of wonky. All of our sites have enrolled at least 1 participant, which is really exciting, and 13 out of 15 have treated at least 1 participant. So we're just waiting on those 2 more so that we can say everybody's done 1. Something else we're excited about is that we've opened a recruitment website. USONA has an awesome recruitment website, and so we were inspired by this and wanted to make it easier for participants to have access to the study sites and for our sites to be able to pre-screen participants better. So on this site, folks can log in or not log in, just go on there, learn about the study, and apply. They answer a few simple questions about themselves. Do they have PTSD? Are they on medications? Would they be willing to commit to the study based on what they understand about it at this point? And that helps our sites filter out some of the folks who call and have mental health disorders but don't necessarily have PTSD, for example. This also helps with the beginning of the informed consent process. If a participant has only read about us in the media, they might have a really biased understanding of what our trial is or how to get into it or what they might need to be to qualify for the study. So this gives them a more succinct and accurate overview, and also presents them with the idea that they might get placebo, which is something that it can be hard for participants to acknowledge up front and also hard for them to deal with if that is how they're randomized within the study. So that's the US. We also have founded MAPS Europe, another separate company or organization that's overseeing all of the studies in Europe. Turns out the regulatory process in Europe is a lot more complicated because they have many, many countries, all of whom have different requirements, and then also they have an overseeing body, the EMA. So we hired people that are specialists in Europe to do this work for us. We're doing this similar type of strategy there. We'll be doing an open label training study for the therapists, and we'll have a sub-study doing a functional MRI to get some more information about that. We'll also do a full phase 3 program, and then once that's complete, we'll apply to the European Medicines Agency to show them our FDA data from US, Canada, and Israel, and the European data. They'll put those together and hopefully approve our drug. These are our potential European phase 3 sites. Again, not everything has been totally ironed out. We're about to start the studies as each country gets regulatory approval. So I think our first country might be ready in the next month or so to begin. So our program goes well beyond MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, or the things that we're interested in, which is exciting for job security reasons. And we've got, obviously, our PTSD in Europe and US, Canada, and Israel. We've completed studies in social anxiety in autistic adults and anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. We're interested in eating disorders, substance use disorders, and group therapy. Group therapy especially because it will really help accessibility moving forward for the treatment, which could be quite expensive. And we're also interested in other drugs, who isn't? We got cannabis for PTSD. We finished a phase 2 study in that. Ayahuasca, we did an observational study for PTSD, and Ibogaine, we've done 2 observational studies for opioid use disorder, which seems really interesting and promising. And a while ago, we did a phase 2 trial of LSD for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. And of course, these aren't all the psychedelics that we could be interested in or that we've helped fund for other researchers. So there's a whole wing of our company that didn't used to exist called investigator-initiated trials. This is a new little subsection where we're giving not only MDMA but also some logistical support for investigators who have most of their own funding. Sometimes we help with that, but most of their own funding and their own independent projects. So some of these studies are with PTSD. We have 2 going on with alcohol use disorder, one with Ben Sessa in the UK, and he's just published some preliminary data on the first 4 participants he's treated that have been really effective. And also mood and anxiety symptoms in advanced stage cancer. And then on top of that, we have many trials in the concept stage all over the world with conflict resolution, grief, multiple sclerosis, palliative care, lots of things going on there. So if you are an investigator with some funding of your own and you want us to put another trial on our plate, you can contact my colleague Melissa. She'd love to hear from you. And the other part of MPBC, the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, is the part responsible for MDMA therapy training, the training program. And this is run by my colleague Shannon Carlin. The main thing we're working on right now is training up enough therapists to support a potential expanded access program or post-approval to be able to get this treatment out there. Right now we have around 48 trained therapists working on our therapist pairs working on our phase 3 program, but that will be not enough at all to meet the need once MDMA is approved. So we're working on training at least 300 new therapists before 2021 for either post-approval or expanded access. If you're interested in being a therapist, here's what you should be. You should have experience with trauma, experience with non-ordinary states of consciousness, and you should be able to provide culturally competent care. And then we provide a lot of training and support, and if you're committed to your own continued growth, you might be a good fit for us. To protect against all of us and to protect our participants, we've come up with the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy code of ethics, which USONA has also adopted for their studies and their guides as well. And so if you want to become a provider, if you're interested in that, these are the steps. So this is the question we get most often, so that's why I'm putting it up there up front. You can sign up for our training newsletter. You go to maps.org/training. If you are already a clinician and you have a site that you think would be a good fit for expanded access or later down the road post-approval, you can think about applying or learn about applying. No sites have been selected yet because we don't have approval to do anything with those sites at this time. But we are evaluating them and making sure we train therapists all over the country. We're also working to make sure, as I've said previously, to make sure we offer culturally informed access to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So internally, over the last year, we've developed a working group called PAINT. So this stands for Psychedelic Allies for Intersectional Navigation and Transformation. And if you think that's a mouthful, don't forget, our name is MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. We are not concise, but we are good at what we do. So this subgroup is making sure that we're moving in the right direction, making sure we're thinking about all the questions that need to be asked about how do we get this treatment to the people who need it the most, or the people who've been underserved by our society and by our healthcare system. And there's also an advisory council on top of this that is made up of people from outside of MAPS but related to the psychedelic field who have clinical experience, training, and things to offer for this direction. So these are the next steps for us. If you don't think we're busy enough, we're doing more things. We're working on compassionate use in Israel. So the government in Israel has already approved 50 patients to be treated outside of a clinical trial for their PTSD with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So this means that the government of Israel has reviewed and said, yeah, your drug is safe enough and effective enough to begin treatment even though you're still in phase 3 studies, which is awesome. That's also what we're applying for in the US through this expanded access program. That's a program the FDA has similar kind of rules about it in terms of the need that needs to be out there. So PTSD is obviously a life-threatening condition. And the safety of the drug and the effectiveness. So if we can demonstrate that to FDA, hopefully they'll approve an expanded access program soon that we'd be able to start. We're also planning MT2, which is a study that will allow our therapists in training to experience MDMA-assisted psychotherapy themselves. in a research study. So they'd be healthy humans. Our primary outcome would be self-compassion, and we'd do some exploratory outcomes like burnout, as being a therapist, and lots of other measures to see how doing even just one session of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy can change you or affect your work. So that's still in the approval process as well. And we are hiring to support our projects. We have a lot to do, and so if you have research experience and you're interested in working for MAPS, or if you're interested in taking over for me on my maternity leave, which we need to find someone to do that, we'd love to hear from you. I'd love to meet you and interview you right now. So does anyone have any questions for me?
As a therapist who'd like to be involved but is not involved with a site and isn't able to do the training, well, why is that, and will that be changing so that regular clinicians can get trained up?
I don't know the exact answer to that, but I believe that once we have been able to get the therapy, we're prioritizing people that have sites and have more therapists that are able to treat more participants and patients in the future. But I believe that one day after approval, and we'll be able to train as many therapists as we can, because our goal is to get the medicine out there to as many participants as we can.
I know in the summer of this year, MAPS had released on their website, a little bit quietly, that there was an incident involving 2 researchers, that there was an abuse of power for the participant in a previous study. Going forward in current as well as future studies, what sort of safeguards would be in place to protect future and current participants against therapists who may be unethical? So
we don't work with those 2 therapists anymore, obviously. We've implemented the Code of Ethics, which is something that all of our therapists get trained on and agree to. So we've implemented a greater policy around that. And all of our therapy sessions are videotaped, and we have a much more rigorous supervision process. So those 4 original therapists that I told you about, Michael and Annie Mithofer, Marcella Odalora, and Bruce Poulter, and we're adding supervisors as well, are much more involved in making sure that effective oversight is given for that. That's something we're very concerned about.
Hi, I wondered if you could say a little bit about the placebo response characteristics and this data so far, and in terms of also whether there's any differences in terms of subgroups, in terms of the type of trauma.
So our first studies, the first phase 2 studies, we did more immediate crossovers where the placebo participants crossed right over into MDMA groups, and with the phase 3 data being much more protected, so we have to maintain the blind until the end of the study. We're waiting until well after that to have the placebo participants cross over for that reason alone. We would like to treat them as fast as possible. Speaking about subgroups and subtypes of PTSD, to my knowledge, we haven't found anything super interesting about that. All of the subtypes seemed to be able to be treated the same, seemed to have the same placebo response, and same with the subgroups of types of trauma, things like that. There are symptom reductions in most participants, not all, but most, just from therapy alone, which you'd expect because we hope that therapy helps people. But they were not close to the types of symptom reductions we saw with MDMA. I recommend that you check the papers out that were just published this year.
When MAPS looks at a possible new therapist within its program, or when starting a pairing between a therapist and a participant, do you consider that the therapist and the patient have a similar cultural background or a different one? And if they're different, how do you consider that in the outcome?
I don't know exactly how the outcomes will be considered moving forward, but I know that we have evaluated all of our therapists to make sure they have cultural competency training, and part of the training program moving forward, their priority is to train therapists of color. We just completed a training almost entirely of therapists of color, so that we can provide more effective care to participants of color. And honestly, as a sponsor, we leave it up to the therapists to practice within the scope and comfort of their work. So if two white therapists would like to treat a black participant or any combination of whatever, we leave it up to them to make sure that's going to be an appropriate relationship and manage that. And then we have supervisory support to help them if there is anything that comes up.
Thank you.
I saw that you were doing studies on MDMA, but also different kinds of psychedelics and also different kinds of mental illnesses and situations. Now, in your MDMA therapist training, is everybody receiving the same kind of training, and is everybody just, your general MDMA therapist, or are you thinking of potentially having a streamlining of eating disorder, specialized MDMA therapists, and PTSD and anxiety or depression?
So our training program right now is geared towards PTSD because that's the indication that we expect to get approval for the soonest and what we're working on the most. But those other studies, like we have an eating disorder study in development, and the principal investigator for that study is doing their own work to train their therapists on top of our training. So there's definitely some like supplemental training that goes on to make sure everyone has what they need to treat a new indication or with a new therapeutic model, like if they're using CPT instead of our inner-directed model, they'll do CPT training as well as that. So we do have some specific training for those folks.
Sometimes PTSD can be caused by a single traumatizing event, or sometimes it can be caused by a complex series of traumatizing events that may not be related to each other, but nevertheless lead to the same symptoms. How effective is MDMA and other psychedelics at treating the complex form of PTSD with many different experiences?
The research that we have so far indicates that complex PTSD in terms of multiple traumatic events are similarly treated with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. For the research that we do, the CAPS-5, the outcome assessment, we have to target one index event or a group of similar events. So, for example, multiple sexual assaults by the same perpetrator could be thought of as one duration event. But something like childhood abuse and a sexual assault and a natural disaster, they would pick the worst one, and we'd target the PTSD, we'd assess their PTSD symptoms based on the worst event, the one that's causing the most symptoms for them. But we don't exclude people who have multiple traumas, and most of our participants have multiple qualifying traumas.
Are they often able to relieve multiple traumas?
Are they often able to?
Relieve multiple traumas.
Yeah. So we don't target the therapy itself to the treatment of only one trauma, it's only the outcome assessment. So they're able to process whatever comes up for them during the session, and usually many of them do.
Thanks. In the end of life, often symptoms of PTSD as well as anxiety, depression get exacerbated. And I was wondering if you would consider hospice as a site.
Yeah, I think there's two investigator-initiated trials coming up, one in palliative care and one with grief, which is different. But I think that would be wonderful for our phase 3 sites and for the particular PTSD stuff that we're working on. We have to work with relatively healthy people to make sure we get a good profile of adverse events. But there are plenty of people interested in that and moving forward with that, and we'll support that work as we can.
And how would interested hospice apply, or?
How would you apply?
Yes, as a hospice.
Yeah, so you'd email my colleague Melissa if you can find some funding for that research.
Since most trauma seems to happen in child and adolescent, is there any possible indication in the future of using this in adolescent populations?
Likely going to be required to do pediatric studies after approval. We've been able to waive those pre-approval, but post-approval we'll start with like ages 16 and 17 and make sure it's safe and tolerable. And depending on how those go, may go younger than that. But that would be, I think, an amazing opportunity to treat trauma earlier and not limit it to just adults to get this treatment.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Charlotte Harrison. Nice job.